Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to gather a cadre of writers, thinkers, and teachers who are transforming the world one character at a time. And it all starts with one thing: a deep understanding of human motivation, why people do what they do, and the forces that drive them. To gain that understanding, I'm teaching Zettelkasten? Well, we've been in a really interesting series on Adlers, How to Read a Book. And we are ready to tackle Chapter 9, where we're going to read the remaining rules in the second stage of analytical reading. So this is really a spot where when we're done with these rules in Chapter 9, we will be ready to dive into the book with our vision online, with our bib cards in hand. We'll know what we're going to put on our bib cards. We'll know what we're going to put on our main cards, and we'll be ready to just really squeeze line by line, word by word, all the juice out of the book. This is where we really get to feel that we're doing that deep, deep reading that Adler talks so much about. So no more tease. I'll come on over to the down-facing camera, and I'll show you the main cards that I've created from Chapter 9, How to Read a Book, Stage 2 of Analytical Reading. See you over there. Okay, here we are on the first card from Chapter 9 of Adler's How to Read a Book, Analytical Reading. Okay, this is where he talks about how the analytical reading compares to our original group of reading, which was our inspectional reading or our superficial reading. So he talks about how when we're going to be doing the analytical reading, we're going to build up from individual words, the terms that have specific meaning to the author. We've already done that phase. The propositions, which are the sentences that express the main points and what the author is going to be trying to prove. We're coming up on that part. And the arguments, the supporting information that the author gives you for why you should believe his propositions. And these tend to be paragraphs. And we're going to compare that in this card to what we do when we're doing inspectional reading or superficial reading. At that stage, we began by looking at the scope of the book, which is the book as a whole. Then we narrowed down to the table of contents, where we looked at the structure of the book, and we did that in our inspectional reading. Finally, we broke it all the way down to individual subdivisions in the book to see how fine-grained the author went with their design. And when we were all done, we picked out a few terms along the way that we actually looked up and found the meaning of. So at that point, we met up with our plan for analytical reading, where we're going to begin with terms. Now, we had one more step that we did in our inspectional reading, and that was that we read the book start to finish all the way through without taking notes. Now, based on what we're going to be doing for our first step in analytical reading, which I did do and showed you, we finished that. That was Chapter 8. I decided that going forward, during that superficial reading, I'm going to highlight any terms I spot to save myself from having to go back through and dig them out again. But now we're going to be looking, the next reading, we're going to be looking at what the author is, the points the author's making, and what he offers to substantiate his points. So I made the note that the complete process then starts broad and focuses inward, then drives from the inside outward again. During the inspectional reading, I plan to spot the terms and keep a bib card and a list with page numbers so I don't have to go diving in for them again. So this next card, Adler's telling us how are we going to find the author's propositions. And he says that he could probably rephrase it a bit to say, in this part, the following points are made. So if we think about points and propositions as being interchangeable, that will give us a good idea of trying to find the author's propositions. I made the remark that the author's propositions will be candidates for main cards because the propositions are the ideas that the author wants to get across, and we want our main cards to be ideas. And so my tagline for this card is the points an author makes are likely his propositions. Okay, so now we're ready for Adler's sixth rule of analytical reading. Mark the most important sentences in a book and discover the propositions they contain. To figure those out, we're going to say, what is the author trying to hammer home? What does he want to convince us of? These are his propositions. And my tagline is, know the author's points, his proposition. Adler then follows it up immediately with his seventh rule. And the reason why he gives them back to back with us is that he's going to go on for the rest of the chapter to be discussing these two rules as though we're going back and forth with them. And that makes good sense, because if we're going to be finding the propositions, once we've got one, we're going to want to look at the arguments that the author makes to support them. So let's look at the seventh rule. The seventh rule of analytical reading says locate or construct the basic arguments in a book by finding them in the connection of sentences. So, of course, the author, if he's truly going to support his proposition, he will either preface the proposition with the arguments that building up to it, where he says, okay, this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and therefore, here's my proposition. Or else he might start with his proposition and say, and I prove it like this. So you have to be on the lookout for both structures. And we'll be wanting to look at, how does the author prove his point? What does he offer to support it? That's our guideline for this Rule 7. And my tagline is, know how the author proves his points. Now, this gave me a really interesting idea that I had to log as a personal reflection. So this is me, I'm the source of this. And then even when I do a personal reflection, I also react to it, because that's the structure of my main cards, and I stick to that very, very rigorously. But I also want to note where I was inspired, because it was inspired out of that Rule 6 and 7 there on page 119. So the thought I got was that it's a great help for me to understand these two rules, because it helps me know what goes on a main card. So worthy points that I really want to remember, are going to make great main cards. And then the arguments or proofs of that point, they can stay on the bib card. So now I know really how to structure my bib cards. I'll be looking for my point. I'll make that as a header, and then I'll put the arguments underneath it. But since the arguments tend to be factoids, it will be propositions that go onto the main cards. So now my reaction to my own thought is that collectively with these rules, we are building an extremely useful bib cards from inspectional reading on. And that is something that I hope to be able to demonstrate, not only with, possibly not so much with this book, because we've already done so much of it, and my bib cards are so fat because of all of the inspectional reading that I put on the card. But when we get to syntopical reading, we're going to be doing analytical reading on other texts, and then I will be able to come up with some beautiful examples of what, from now on, what my bib cards ought to look like. I'm really feeling inspired. Now, I went on to make another thought here, because for some applications, sometimes, some people, some purposes, those factoids that support the point are going to be of vital importance and interest. If you've got the kind of a situation where you need to come up with those factoids from memory on demand in discussions, and that's part of what you're doing with your Zettelkasten, then you may want to keep those facts closer at hand than having to pull out the bib card every time you want access to them. Well, we've got the perfect way of doing that with our bib cards as already designed. We have this little thing called an asterisk, and I've mentioned many times that anytime you need to put information on the back side of a main card, all you have to do is give it an asterisk. And here's an example. This one was the associative brain opens the door to a cognitive statement of meaning. We saw that in the last chapter. And I made notes on the back side of the card because I did some reflection on it on my yellow legal pad. And so I wrote where that reflection took place. And then I even had an add-on comment that I also included on this card. So that's what I mean by putting an asterisk on it. But to go to the point that I'm making here is, if you're in one of those situations where you need those vital facts and you need them close at hand, put that asterisk on your card, flip it over, and copy the vital points onto the back of the main card. In that way, you will keep your main card pure, because main cards should be about ideas, and yet those needed facts will be very close at hand. So my tagline for that is, vital facts can be handled by an asterisk on the main card and put on the back. Okay. Now, this note I made is a quote from Adler where he's talking about sentences that are difficult to understand. And he's saying that you want to find out in the book sentences that are important for you. And a sentence that you do not readily understand is automatically a sentence that's important for you. Now, that sentence may not have been important for the author because it might have been something that was obvious to the author, but if it's not readily obvious to you, you need to figure out what that sentence says, and therefore that sentence, by definition, is important for you. However, that said, very often those are exactly the sentences that are also important for the author, because very often when the author is making their most important points, those are the ones that are hard to understand, because that's where some novelty is being brought in by the author. And I've seen something similar to this happen when I'm working with translations. Sometimes you can get up to a spot where the sentence becomes completely unintelligible, and what you're looking at is a spot there where the translator did not understand what the author was trying to say and just put the words down on the page, word for word, or took a stab at translating it and ended up making a total muddle of the thing. So you have to be aware of that as well. And sometimes you really won't get the meaning out until you either find a different translation where the translator understood it better, or until you get a copy in the original language and have sufficient capacity in that language to understand it. So my tagline for this thought was, slow down. If it's hard to understand, it's the most important. Now, this one is partly from Mortimer Adler and partly from me. Adler says that it's an essential part of reading to be perplexed and to know you're perplexed. He says wonder is the beginning of wisdom in learning from a book, as well as learning from nature. Well, I tend to go fear factor, and so this card was very, very valuable for me, because I could make a note that if I'm frightened and feeling lost in not understanding, that's actually a good sign. And I just need to take a few deep breaths and plunge ahead with excitement and curiosity. And my reward for that effort is going to be understanding. That brought up something that I do sometimes. I do this panic of, oh, I don't get it, overwhelms me. And I find that I'm not even looking at the words on the page. I'm looking off in the distance and thinking to myself, I don't get it. And then I've got a little signal that I worked out to myself that snaps me out of that kind of behavior. And it goes like this. I hold my hands over my eyes and shake my head and say, I can't see, I can't see. Well, that's obviously you can't see, you got your hands over your eyes, but it reminds me that, am I actually looking at the words on the page and saying I don't get them? Okay, now this one brought me to a change in behavior, like right as of the point of making this main card. Adler says that it's really, really important that you express the author's proposition in your own words, because if you don't do that, you might have the author's verbiage down just fine, but you haven't attached any meaning to the words. So it's really important to verify that you have an understanding of the words by turning those words into your own language, and not just pushing the words around on the page a little bit, changing the tense, really, really restating it in your own words. And oh my gosh, that sounds like something that I read in the past when I was first learning Zettelkasten. The question of, are you going to do, what did they call it, a reformulation note, something like that. It got a fancy term. And I just let it go and went merrily on. I mean, you've seen even in the note just now, blue ink, that means I copied a quote from right off the Adler's words right off the page. Well, it turns out to be really important that you actually prove to yourself that you understand it. And if we don't do that, we're missing an important opportunity. And I phrase that as that we teach ourselves the knowledge when we say it in our own words. We become our own teachers of the subject matter. We interpret the text for ourselves. So my tagline for this, copying the author's words misses a learning opportunity. And I gave as an alternate term for misses, loses a learning opportunity. Adler goes on to stress this even more. He says that being able to restate the author's proposition is going to be of enormous importance for us when we get to the next stage, which is in topical reading, where we're reading from different authors on the same subject matter. If we're not capable of taking an author's propositions and putting them into our own words, then we will not be able to tell whether this second author that we read is saying the same thing or something different, whether he's agreeing or disagreeing, because we'll think they're making two completely different points because they use completely different words. So it's really vital if we plan to do any syntopical reading, which I plan to go all the way through Adler's book here and address requests and topical reading as well. So this is something that's important for me. So I made a resolution. I resolved to restate the author's proposition in my words. If a quote is especially delicious, okay, I'll make a separate card for just the quote, and I'll put down why I thought that particular wording was so wonderful that I wanted to capture the quote. But that will come after I've made the card that puts the author's statement in my words so that I know I've understood it. Okay, so how do we know if we've understood? Adler gives us an interesting test. He says, can you give an example? Usually a proposition is making some kind of a general statement about something that's true in the world. Well, can you give a for instance? Maybe you don't have an actual for instance in your experience. Can you give a realistic, imaginary for instance? And this is often a very good test. And a place to put that might be in your personal reflection. If you want to double check yourself, if you're at all worried, you could put the reflection could be, and a possible example of this where it might come up in my life would be. Or I also believe that the fact that we've created this personal reflection on what the author said is in and of itself proof that we have understood what the author said. And therefore, it's my belief that a Zettelkasten, main card of a Zettelkasten, really super reinforces what Adler's saying in analytical reading, because we have it all there. We have the author statement, we have our reflection on it, which means we must have understood it, and then we go one step further. We put that tagline across the top, showing that we were able to take that and make it as succinct as a single sentence. So my tagline for this is a quality Zettelkasten main card meets the test of understanding. And if you can make a quality Zettelkasten main card with the author and with your response, you have proven to yourself that you understand, and you've taught the material to yourself. And because this relation to yourself meets the test of being about you, it's automatically something that your mind is going to be able to recall more easily. And the last thing in this chapter is where Adler talks about Rule 8 of analytical reading. And that is where we're asked to decide if the author solved all of his stated problems or not. Now, where did he get his stated problems? Adler says, well, step 4 in inspectional reading gave us his stated problems. I looked back, and that was where we're supposed to read the blurb on the dust jacket if the book had a dust jacket. So does that mean we don't get to do Rule 8 if the book didn't have a dust jacket? Somehow I think not. So I took a slightly different way of describing it. I would say that at the end of step 4 in inspectional reading, we were asked to decide if we wanted to read the book after we had tried to discover the main points of the book. And so for me, if a book does not have a dust jacket, I'm going to still try to discover the main points of the book ahead of time, which should be the promotional material, the preface material, the advertising material, good grief, the sales material on Amazon or wherever you bought the book. Because Rule 8 says we need to ask ourselves if the author met his own bar. He set the bar for himself. Did he succeed in passing that? And if not, was he aware of it? And one other thing, what if he did meet his initial objectives? Did he come up with any new problems that still need to be solved as a part of solving the ones that he was ready to tackle? So now my response to that was, with this last rule of the second stage of analytical reading, we know how well the author made his case. And I would like you to notice Rule 8 is not written in blue. This is my restatement of Adler's Rule 8. I mean to keep my promise to myself that my main cards will all be my restatement of the author's main point with a separate main card with a quote on it, if I think the quote is of sufficient value in and of itself because it was such a lovely turn of phrase, or there was something truly exceptional and memorable about that quote. So that concludes Chapter 9 of How to Read a Book. We now know how we're going to go about determining an author's message. And now, if you've been following along not only with this series, but with a book you're reading, such as the book that I've been reading, Simon Sinek's Start With Why, we've got a job to do. We've done our job of outlining the book. We've got our table of contents. We know what the structure was. We know the main points that the author was driving home. We've already come to terms with the author. Now it's up to us to take each section and each division, identify the ideas, the points that the author is trying to get across, and the arguments that the author is making in support of that point. That's going to be pretty exciting. Don't expect me to be back tomorrow with this, but I don't want to put off the people who've been asking questions. I know this is a lovely advanced topic, and I love doing it because I'm learning and I'm getting to share what I'm learning today. I read today, I share today. I love that. But it's not fair for the people who are just coming onto Zettelkasten and have basic questions, and they've been put off for a very long time because I've been on this more advanced topic, Adler's How to Read a Book. So for the next few days, I will be answering some viewers' questions and covering some things that are more on the basic side, but I will be back when I complete my work on Chapter 9, Determining an Author's Message. So when I can come back to you and show you the bib cards with Sinek's main points and how he presents his arguments for each, then I think that will be a lot of fun. And at that point in time, I also want to go over with you what I've learned about what I now think will be an ideal bib card design when you really need to get into a book and go dive into it in a very serious way. So it'll be a few days before I'm back to this topic, but that gives you time too, because if you're following along, then you also have to do it. See you then. Bye-bye.